Good afternoon. I'm Wael Zayat, CEO of Engage, a Muslim Get Out the Vote organization, and the National Coordinator for the American Coalition for Syria, and somewhat of a fellow at the Middle East Institute. Great to be with all of you, and great to be back to my alma mater. I'm an MSFS graduate, did 2 amazing years here at Georgetown, and it's always good to be back. We are talking about what we have learned from the failure to promote democracy. I'm not sure we've learned much, but we have an outstanding panel here with us to examine this question. The Arab Spring came and went. We are over a decade removed from it. There's been revolutions, counter-revolutions, revolutions 2.0. The region is still in flux. Did democracy actually fail? And if not, where did it go? What led to the failures or to the challenges that we saw somewhat recently in places like Tunisia? What's happening to countries that are still contesting that question violently, including in Syria? What about states that seem to have stabilized, like Egypt and others? What about Sudan? Where will the next spark come? Is Gaza another spark? Just not under an Arab dictatorship. What's the role of the US, Europeans, the rest of the international community in not just addressing this question, but in promoting or undermining democracy in the region? So there's obviously many aspects to this. What agency do the people of the region have? Are they simply subjects of a post-colonial world? Or have they had a say in what we have seen? And when we say they, who is they? Is it just the Arabs? Is it the Arab Sunnis? Is it other actors on the ground? We talk about the divisions in the region between different groups and different ideologies. How much of that is generated from the region? How much of it is a product of foreign interference? So a lot to examine and discuss, and we have 4 outstanding scholars, professors, experts who are going to speak briefly for up to 10 minutes, I was told. And then we'll open it up for questions. And so first, the way I'm going to do it, I'm going to introduce each speaker separately, but briefly. The first speaker is Professor Emirata Tamara Sun, who is a professor in the history of Islam at Georgetown University. Professor, if you can come up here.
Amazingly, we're actually sort of on time, even though we got a late start. And so for that reason, I might take 11 minutes. I'll do my best. So, as you know, when this organization was founded over 20 years ago, among our objectives was to counter claims that Islam is incompatible with democracy, and hopefully to garner support for pro-democracy movements within the Muslim majority world. Countless conferences and publications over the past decades have demonstrated clearly that Islam is no more anti-democratic than any other religion, and that Muslims, like everyone else, value freedom and democracy. But Euro-American policy types held on to their old prejudices no matter what we said or no matter what happened, specifically prejudices against political Islam, as they called it, or Islamism. Western governments supported Algeria's cancellation of elections in 1992, for example, saying that the Islamists only wanted democracy as a cover for authoritarianism. The success of the 2010-2011 uprisings, the so-called Arab Spring, seemed to vindicate our claims. We thought, finally, DC will pay attention and provide support for democratization in the Muslim world. In fact, some of you might remember that when we were organizing the 2012 CSID annual conference, we were tempted to title the conference, do you remember this, Aswan?
We told you so.
The Arab Spring, we told you so. We literally were considering doing that. But starting exactly 1 year after the first ever democratic elections in Egypt, anti-democratic forces toppled the two Arab Spring successes. And yes, with outside interference, no question about that. Egypt's first ever democratically elected president was ousted in a military coup supported by key U.S. allies. He died in prison 6 years later. Tunisia's democracy has been replaced, as we've been talking about, with an authoritarian regime, again with critical support from key U.S. allies. Rashid Ghannouchi, the leader of Tunisia's democratic transition, was arrested, as we said earlier, exactly 1 year ago today, and has been sentenced to 3 years in prison. Outside the Arab world, Pakistan's popular democratic Prime Minister Imran Khan was ousted in 2022 in a move orchestrated by the military, which is very closely allied with the U.S. He and countless members of his party and family have been incarcerated. Imran Khan himself was recently sentenced to a total of 34 years in prison on obviously politically motivated charges. All of this without a word of protest from the U.S. In fact, despite it all, the U.S. continues to work with authoritarian regimes around the world. We used to think those policies were a result of policymakers just not knowing enough. We thought we could educate them. We thought if they knew more, they would make better policies. I hate to say how long it took for me personally to recognize that those policies were deliberate, and that promotion of democracy and human rights is not the goal of U.S. foreign policy. People who enter and survive and achieve high positions in U.S. policy circles are interested in one thing, what is euphemistically called the national interest. How to promote that is what universities train would-be policy people to do. In programs like IR and political science. No offense, Nutter. No offense. People are not trained to understand the people who are affected by our policies by studying languages, history, religion, and culture. They're trained in strategies to maintain U.S. dominance wherever possible. They're not even trained to think critically about what is actually in the U.S. national interest, about what would actually promote the well-being of the general populace, about promoting the common good. Only how to devise policies to protect and promote the strategic advantage of economic interests of U.S. corporations, not U.S. people, U.S. corporations. How did this become the core interest of a set of colonies that declared independence based on their belief in inalienable human rights? How did this become the driver of foreign policy behind Reagan's shining city on the hill rhetoric? The reality is that the U.S. emerged from World War II as the world's richest and most militarily powerful country in the world, and since that time, its foreign policy has focused on maintaining that strategic advantage. That meant, and continues to mean, stymieing any efforts to undermine the system on which U.S. wealth is based, starting with communist Russia. So the State Department's first Director of Policy Planning, established after World War II, George Kennan, described the policy as preventing the USSR from challenging U.S. might. He called it containing it geographically. To the public, this was described in the Truman Doctrine as support for democracies against authoritarian threats. That's what we were all taught. That's what we believed until recently, to be deprogrammed. That's why so many people so naively continue to think that the U.S. is interested in promoting democracy and human rights. But that's not what the U.S. has actually done. Instead, we have supported any pro-Western capitalist government, no matter how undemocratic. And in fact, the U.S. has actively undermined democratic governments if they were insufficiently capitalist. No one here needs to be reminded of Operation Ajax, when the U.S. and the U.K. collaborated in overthrowing the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953, which is, of course, the root of Iran's anti-Americanism. The next year, the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of Guatemala's democratically elected president. 1960, it was Congo's Patrice Lumumba. 1963, Vietnam's Diem. 1973, Chile's Allende. The list goes on. In the 1980s, Reagan's UN ambassador, Jeane Kirkpatrick, devised a more candid version of how to go about containing socialism and protecting capitalism, more candid than Truman's promotion of democracy. According to the Kirkpatrick Doctrine, it's preferable to support anti-communist dictatorships than to support democracies that might tilt towards socialism. Kirkpatrick was key in advocating the Reagan administration's support for El Salvador's and Argentina's military dictatorships and the Nicaraguan Contras, for example. After the implosion of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, there was a brief period of wondering how to focus U.S. foreign policy now that there was no specter of the evil genie of communism. George Herbert Walker Bush even spoke of a peace dividend. That was his phrase. Now that we could focus on peaceful pursuits, maybe even learn from the most experienced soldiers of World War II. For example, President Eisenhower, who said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed." This is President Eisenhower. "Those who are cold and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children." Under that first Bush administration, Colin Powell, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, actually called for expanding NATO to include Russia. Both Gorbachev and his successor Yeltsin were all for it. But instead, the White House listened to the claims of IR-trained people who argued, "Oh no, this is no time to let down our militarism, especially in view of the threat of militant Islam." That's what was behind the anti-democratic policies in the Middle East that I just described. How is the U.S. national interest described today? Retired Dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and frequent political appointee Joseph Nye wrote in 1999 that the national interest is nothing more than, quote, "the set of shared priorities regarding relations with the rest of the world that would justify the unilateral use of force." Now that's nice. This is what we teach people. And since the fall of the Soviet communism, Nye said that the core focus of U.S. national interest is, wait for it, maintaining international order. Maintaining international order. That means maintaining the status quo in which the U.S. corporations are the richest and most powerful corporations on earth. And he gave credit to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright for identifying the U.S. as the indispensable nation the indispensable nation, that's a quote, for maintaining international order. That might be what they're talking about with that euphemistic rules-based order that Trita Parsi talked about. The indispensable nation, American exceptionalism. What about in the Middle East specifically? How is international order, the international system in which we can thrive? That's again a quote from Nye. How is it perceived in the Middle East? Foreign policy expert Robert Lieber wrote in 2021 that the U.S. has 4 key national interests in the Middle East: maintaining a secure supply of oil, preventing the region from falling under hostile power, support for America's allies and partners, he mentions in particular Israel and Saudi Arabia, and maintaining the old standby regional stability, that is, the status quo. Lieber said that in post-Cold War years, non-nuclear proliferation and counterterrorism had also emerged as national interests. But commitment to democracy and human rights, again I'm quoting from Lieber, he says, they receive little more than rhetorical support rather than practical support. Failure to support fledgling Arab Spring democracies is clear evidence of that. More recently, in 2022, when people expressed concern about U.S. alliances with authoritarian governments in the Gulf after the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi government agents, another former director of policy planning, Dennis Ross, wrote that hard power matters. Yes, the murder of Khashoggi and other human rights violations are concerning, but we need Saudi oil, he said. Therefore, and I quote, the U.S. must do what the U.S. has always done: balance values and interests. How much? 1 minute, almost done. So, what drives U.S. policy is not democracy. It's the national interest in maintaining international order, the status quo. So I'm concluding, this is Orwellian doublespeak at its best. Because ultimately no one's interests are really served by these policies, except the shareholders in the corporations that get the military, technical, and oil and gas contracts in that status quo. That status quo is what's killing thousands of people daily in our countless wars and killing our planet, and, as Eisenhower put it, killing the hopes of our children. And I'm speaking as a teacher. I talk to students who say they came to this school to learn how to make the world a better place. Instead, they learn how to promote this national interest. So what can we do about it? How can we work to promote democratic values and human rights, the real national and international interest? First, we have to recognize that success will come not because of, but despite U.S. foreign policy as it's currently formulated, which means that our hopes lie in civil society, people just like us. Second, we have to start in the U.S., and here I'll speak again as an educator, revising how we train people to make policy decisions. We have bad policy, not because policymakers don't know enough, even though they don't know enough, but because we train people to make bad policy, policy that violates the principles we claim to uphold. I'll close with another quote from Eisenhower. In a less well-known part of his 1961 warning about the military-industrial complex, he said, "The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded." So my practical advice regarding how to promote democracy: we need to bring our curricula into line with our shared values of freedom and human security. human security. Until we do, nothing will change. Thank you.
Professor, for that, and folks will have an opportunity to ask the questions at the end. I'm going to now call Nader Hashemi, who is the Associate Professor and Director of the El Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding right here at Georgetown University. Professor.
Well, let me begin by thanking Radwan and his team for putting this conference together. We're happy to be sort of co-sponsoring this event. The CSID annual conference has sort of become like a family, second family for us. So I'm happy to be back to offer some remarks. I don't have a coherent and well thought of presentation. I just have some scattered remarks that I want to present to you. And the title of my presentation is Reflections on Gaza, Why Palestinian National Liberation is Inseparable from Arab Regional Democratization. And so what I'm really interested in is three issues. One, the question of Palestinian national rights, Palestinian self-determination, and of course the question of democracy in the Middle East, and how these two things are linked and how they go together. And now, of course, the question of Gaza is on all of our minds. So I'm trying to think through the relationship between these ideas, these themes, these aspects of Middle East and Islamic politics. So October 7th, the October 7th crisis in Israel-Palestine is a watershed and transformative moment in both global politics and the politics of the region in the Middle East. While much of the intellectual and policy commentary on this crisis is focused on Hamas, the Israeli government, the Biden administration, the role of Arab states has evaded critical scrutiny. And what I want to do is try and fill this gap a little bit in my presentation this morning against the backdrop of the Gaza crisis. I want to critically analyze or say some critical things about leading Arab states, both before and after October the 7th. I want to focus some of my remarks on a critical evaluation of the Abraham Accords, which set the stage, in my view, to the October 7th crisis. The record suggests, I think, that if you look at what's happening right now, that there's a degree of complicity by some of these Arab states in what's going on in Gaza today. This can best be explained by the nature of authoritarian politics in the Arab world that is deeply fearful of independent Palestinian nationalism and, grassroots insurgents movements. And these Arab states look toward Israel as a guarantor of the authoritarian status quo in the Middle East. One of the key lessons from Gaza, or the Gaza crisis, I would like to provocatively argue, is that Palestinian self-determination is deeply connected and perhaps dependent on some future Arab political transformation away from authoritarianism and in the direction of democracy. These two processes, I believe, are deeply connected. They're intertwined. They can't be artificially separated. At the very least, some serious movement toward democracy in the Arab world would significantly increase the prospects of advancing Palestinian national rights and a lasting peace in the region between Israelis and Palestinians. So what I'm about to argue is considered to be blasphemous in the context of the U.S. foreign policy debate, the mainstream U.S. foreign policy debate. You're not supposed to say these things, even think these things. But I want to radically reframe the relationship between Arab states, Israel, and the question of Palestine in the context of the Abraham Accord framework, which really bring these two things together. Nonetheless, given how bad the situation is in Gaza, that's what's really motivating me to sort of think through this particular topic, to think outside of the box, to think long term. This is not any short term I don't have any short term analysis or solutions to what's happening in the region. So we're all aware of what's happening in Gaza. The more I look at it, the more every day passes by, the situation continues to produce a horror show. And of course, what's so tragic about the situation in Gaza today is that notwithstanding the last 6 months of horror, in many ways, one can make an argument that perhaps the worst is yet to come, particularly if Israel decides to move into Rafah. The number of children killed is one of the distinguishing characteristics of happening in Gaza. I just read a UN report yesterday that said every 10 minutes in Gaza, one child is either killed or wounded. One of the unique aspects of the war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, unlike any other mass atrocities, is that the Palestinians have nowhere to flee to. If you compare what's happening in Gaza to other cases of genocide, in many of those cases, there was an option of people fleeing the horror. The bombing raids that Israel has conducted with U.S. support, the weaponization of food as a deliberate policy of starvation has produced independent reports by human rights organizations, one after the other, charging the Israeli government of using starvation as a method of warfare. The cultural genocide in Gaza, in terms of the destruction of the cultural heritage, the university systems, the libraries, is one of the underreported aspects of this horror show. And so the more I watch this and the more I look at it, so I'm scratching my head to think, well, what's the way out? What's the way forward? The World Court ruled at the end of January, 15-2, the judges on the World Court, 15 out of the 17 judges, made a ruling that what we're seeing in Gaza is a plausible case of genocide. And if you look at what's happening, the role of the West, the role of the United States, is central to this story. An argument can be made that many of the leaders of the West are complicit in the Gaza horror show. The arms shipments, according to the last time I checked, are still flowing, notwithstanding this situation. And if you just look at the framing of the debate in Gaza, it's so one-sided and it's so biased, and you're all familiar with it. The Palestinians deserve humanitarian aid, and Israel has the right to sort of defend itself because of what happened in October the 7th. In other words, the narrative is, let's give the Palestinians in Gaza one last supper before they die of some communicable disease or in an Israeli bombing raid. But at the same time, let's not stop Israel from doing whatever it wants to protect its security. The Palestinians are not entitled to those same rights to security that we guarantee to Israel. And so the whole framing here is deeply biased. It's pretty clear that when it comes to the West, the value of an Israeli life matters more than a Palestinian life. And so no one really is going to come to the rescue of the Palestinians. Anyone who's waiting for some sort of shift, some sort of future president, some sort of electoral change anywhere in the West that can make a difference in terms of the plight of the Palestinians, that's wishful thinking. So the question then comes, where can we turn to for hope, for perhaps an alternative way forward, for a new opening for the Palestinians and for a genuine lasting peace in the region that would include justice for the Palestinians? And so as I think through this issue, I think we need to focus much more on the Middle East, the Arab world in particular, and the regional context, and how a weakening of authoritarian regimes and the possible rise of democracy movements or democratic transitions might affect the prospects for Palestinian rights and advance a genuine peace process. And recall during the Arab Spring, this issue first came up. There's report after report that when the Arab Spring begins in Egypt, Benjamin Netanyahu starts to panic. And he's repeatedly on the phone calling Obama to not give up on Hosni Mubarak. There was deep fears also, in the West on many quarters in terms of what political transitions, democratic transitions might mean for the future security of the region, particularly for the Israel-Palestine conflict. And Moshe Aarons, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense from the Likud party in Israel, actually reflected on this topic in the early days of the Arab Spring revolt, where he wrote an essay in Haaretz where he contemplated the viability of an Israeli national security doctrine that was predicated on peace with Arab dictators. And he wrote the following, quote, "The ugly facts are that the two peace treaties that Israel concluded so far, the one with Egypt and the other with Jordan, were both signed with dictators, Anwar Sadat and King Hussein. What's more, the negotiations that for a while held some promise of reaching a peace agreement with Syria and with the Palestine Liberation Organization were also conducted with unsavory dictators. The question that Israelis ask themselves at this moment is if Hosni Mubarak's regime were to be replaced by a democratically elected government in Egypt, would this government continue to maintain the nearly 32-year peace treaty with Israel?" End quote. Moshe Aarons came pretty close to admitting what many scholars of the Middle East and scholars of the Israel-Palestine conflict in particular have known for a very long time, that only a long-term, solid peace agreement that can stand the test of time has to be made not with the dictators of the Arab world, but with the people of the Arab world. And that can only happen if Israel is willing to give some justice to the Palestinians as a precondition for Israel being accepted as some sort of legitimate entity in the eyes of the Arab Islamic world. And of course, to date, no Israeli government, or U.S. government for that matter, has been willing to do this in practical terms. And then we had the Abraham Accords, where we were told, that this was a wonderful sort of way around the question of Palestine. The question of Palestine didn't matter anymore. All we needed to do was focus on normalization agreements. And if you follow the debate here in Washington, D.C., just prior to October the 7th, there was huge euphoria over Saudi-Israeli normalization. I'm pretty sure Blinken and his team were thinking that they're going to win the Nobel Peace Prize if they can pull this off. But remember the basic nature and ideological orientation of the Abraham Accords. It was based on several core pillars that were built into the DNA of this agreement. That the Abraham Accords is not a peace deal. The Abraham Accords was not really a peace deal, as I said, between Israel and the Arab world. It was a peace deal between Israel and Arab dictators. The question of Palestine didn't matter to the Abraham Accords. Jared Kushner, the key architect, openly stated this when he announced the Abraham Accords. The persistence of Arab authoritarianism was a central part of the Abraham Accords. You couldn't ask Arab publics to participate in any deliberation because they wanted justice for the Palestinians, and you're not going to get that under this current arrangement. Israel wasn't going to give any justice to the Palestinians, and the Arab dictators were just going to, keep the population in check. That was built into the Abraham Accords. Yeah, got it. And so that's the sort of status quo. That's the situation, before October the 7th. In other words, autocracy in the Arab world is a necessary precondition for the success of the Abraham Accords. And just imagine the reverse scenario for a moment, that let's say there was actually an open civil society, there was public accountability in the Arab world on questions related to Israeli-Palestinian peace and the question of justice. No Arab public would allow for any sort of peace treaty with Israel to go forward unless there was something in it for the Palestinians, which is why you can only have the Abraham Accords with dictatorial regimes. You can't have it with an Arab democracy. And of course, this is a position that the United States is perfectly happy with. The European Union is perfectly happy with this. The Abraham Accords, have been supported by Western powers based on this arrangement. In other words, authoritarianism is in the DNA of the Abraham Accords. It's the oxygen that fuels it and sustains it. You remove it, and the entire edifice collapses. So, looking forward, and I'm going to wrap up here because my time is up. Looking forward, and given the fundamental fact that what we've been seeing over the last 6 months in Gaza suggests that, there is no serious Western resolve to support Palestinian rights. I can't see it coming anytime soon. The West will continue to maintain this double standard where Israel's security matters much more than Palestinian security. And so the only way forward seems to me that might produce some hope is the weakening of authoritarian regimes in the Arab world that could perhaps open doors for Palestinian rights. Arab autocracies fundamentally at the end of the day are on Israel's side. And if you follow what's been happening right now, they're vocally supportive of the Palestinians, but privately when Blinken comes into town, they say, finish the job, Israel, because they have a deep fear and a self-interest in making sure that that Hamas and any sort of popular insurgency from below is not victorious because of the example that might set for the rest of the region. So perhaps looking forward, in conclusion, democratic Arab states, were they to exist at some point down the road, would force Israel to make serious concessions before a long-standing peace agreement could be established as a precondition for a broader, sort of stable and more just political order in the Middle East. So that's what I'm thinking about. I realize this is a tall order, but I don't think authoritarianism in the Arab world is sustainable over the long term. It's not going to happen, particularly in countries in North Africa. I think these are short-term calculations that the West has made, and I think at the end of the day, those calculations will not stand up to critical scrutiny as populations start to revolt over the repressive status quo that defines their reality. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Radwan and Dr. Asma, as always, for this and everything else you do. Radwan, brace yourself. For the first time, I'm going to end optimistically. So 3 years ago, many noted the formal end of political Islam, when in parliamentary elections in the Arab world, the ruling Islamist party in Morocco, the Justice and Development Party, suffered a crushing defeat. Where they went from 125 seats to 12, far behind the main liberal opponents, the National Rally of Independence and the Authenticity and Modernity Party. Both of those parties were very close to Morocco's royal palace. This development came less than 2 months after the soft coup, or the coup by Tunisia's President Kais Saied, pitting him against Islamist party and Nahda, which led to the removal and ultimately the jailing of Rashid Ghannouchi. Contrary to the case in Morocco, President Saied removed the prime minister and suspended the elected parliament, assumed the executive power and the power of public persecution, and appointed loyal figures to several critical positions. And he barely faced any criticism or pressure from Western democracies. Just after that, the son of the late Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, Saif al-Islam, announced that he was going to run for president. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad proudly announced that he won elections by 95% of the vote after a decade of war against the Syrian people, which will theoretically allow him to stay in power until 2028, or at least as he prepares his son, Hafiz, to rule after him. And just on a side note, we spoke earlier today about the late Saadettin Ibrahim. I believe it was in a CSID conference that he came up with the term Gumlukeya, which was the moshing together of the republic and monarchy, resulting in hereditary republics. And so he was reflecting on what he saw about to happen in Egypt with Mubarak and his son Gamal, which had just happened in Syria, and what he was kind of foreshadowing in the future. So I just wanted to mention that. In Egypt, the crackdown on the Brotherhood has continued with not just the death sentence against members of the Brotherhood that are both in exile and in the country, but 2 years ago, the parliament passed a law that enables the government to repress, arrest, and put in front of military tribunals any civil servants or citizens that are perceived of as being linked to the Brotherhood. Now, these trends suggest two things. First, that the era that enabled political Islamist parties in the Arab world to breathe, participate in politics, and gain power among the Arab revolutions is over. And the defeat of the last standing moderate JDP party in Morocco marks a decline of political Islam in the Arab world. But I'm going to challenge that in the end. And second, that the autocratic republic regimes are alive and kicking. With decades of rooted dictatorship, corruption, manipulation, resources, and foreign support, they've proved that they have what it takes to consolidate power against Islamists, against anyone who challenges them or suggests a democratic alternative. To that end, these regimes have applied different tactics and strategies to get rid of their opponents, their critics, and their rivals. They've created a vicious circle that almost makes it impossible to escape. And ultimately, after a decade of the eruption of the Arab Spring revolutions, Arab governments have managed to oust the Islamists from the main scene and in one way or another. This is not to say that Islamist parties were perfect. Compared to other Arab parties, yes, they were generally more organized and better connected, but in the end, just like other parties, they existed after long periods of repressive, dark moments and environments controlled primarily by regimes that led them to have several shortcomings. I'm not going to focus on that. That's in my forthcoming book. While some of them defied sincere and honest advice that was given to them even by Dr. Ghannouchi, and committed several grave mistakes, others showed pragmatism and a better understanding of the political game. Yet ultimately, these parties couldn't survive for both internal and strategically external reasons. This comes at a time where the view of new types of relations and realignments are actually taking place in the Middle East today. In the Biden post-Trump era, countries that were historically in opposition over the past decade until very recently, like Egypt and the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar, are opening up, making efforts at rapprochement and trying to explore opportunities to normalize relations. Now, these reflect a new geopolitical and regional moment, and also raises questions about the fate of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in the future. Now, for so long, these regimes have promoted a discourse that portrays the Brotherhood as the greatest challenge to stability and prosperity in the region, and the biggest threat to their nations and to Western interests. Now, following this logic, now that the Islamists are not in charge and far gone, things should be very rosy in these countries. But they're not. The main reason is that the Brotherhood has not been really the biggest problem in the Arab world. It's the Arab regimes themselves and their supporters that might be the problem. Political and economic security indicators in the Arab world, along with state of freedoms and high unemployment rates and the level of repression, and they're currently much worse compared to previous times. And it's expected to continue to get worse if we stay on the current course. And as I've been saying for years here at CSID conferences since 2013, repression has never led to long-term stability. Hence, if there's a will, whether it's the Islamist parties or the Arab regimes, to learn from the past, to grasp the right lessons, to fix things, then it might be now that's the right time to do it. So I have a couple of reflections on these terms, democracy and Islamism. Is political Islam or Islamism or the era of Islamist politics over? For a while, I thought so, until pretty recently. The regional world order has shifted, and so have the sources of the narrative of Islam in politics. While much has been written about the changing role of the U.S. as a global power, President Biden and his administration have made repeated statements about reclaiming the U.S. position as the leader of the free world and the promoter of democracy, and this has come amid growing authoritarian trends across the globe, in part due to increased influence of countries like Russia and China. But one facet of American foreign policy and the grand strategy to remain unaffected by this renewed effort to promote democracy is the U.S. approach towards the Arab world. The Biden administration has been taking a lukewarm stance about this thing called democracy. And although it emphasizes democracy to its foreign policy, it has essentially refused to hold human rights violators accountable, even when they affect and persecute American citizens. The Middle Eastern exception to the American democracy promotion strategy remains, and there seems to be little appetite among American decision makers to apply the same ideals of sustainable global order to this region. Citizens of the region are aware of the failed democratic strategy and blatant hypocrisy. They don't believe the U.S. is the bulwark against authoritarian forces, and that is much more apparent today than the results of the 8th Arab Opinion Index conducted by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. And here's where it gets interesting. According to the survey report, given everything I just said, the percentage of Arabs who think that democracy is the best system of governance for their countries has grown from 67% in 2011, just after the revolutions, to 72% in 2022. And so this doesn't mean that they see the role of the U.S. in helping the region achieve its democratic principles. They don't. 78% consider the U.S. as the biggest source of threat to instability in the region. By contrast, 57% think that Iran is a threat to stability in the region, and 57% also think that Russia is a threat. So given this increase, 72% commitment to the idea that democracy is the governance structure of the future, 78% of them don't believe that the U.S. is promoting that or is actually a bigger threat to that. Now, American policymakers should consider what these numbers apply, that the U.S. reputation is so bad and so synonymous with hypocrisy that Arab respondents view actors like Iran and Russia as less threatening. The Arab world continues to be rife with levels of instability. Arab regimes are largely failing to provide basic services and guarantees to rights, and Arab citizens understandably see no benefit from American leadership on the world stage. Such widespread attitudes not only might undermine American interests in the region, but also pose risks to broader security of the international system. And all of this data was collected before October 7th. As American legitimacy deteriorates, this leaves a vacuum for other powers like Russia and China to advance their interest and their anti-democratic ideologies in the Arab world and across the globe. Moreover, the prospect for democracy could become less attractive when the primary advocates of this, the U.S., is seen as hypocritical. This signals that there must not be a Middle Eastern exception to U.S. policies on global security and prosperity. Now, on religiosity, according to the Arab Barometer Project, the Middle East and North Africa has seen an increased level in religiosity, particularly among youth over the last 5 years, more so than pre- and post-Arab Spring. What these implications what might they have for the region? Does this rise in personal religiosity correspond with changing views on the role of politics and religion? And might this foreshadow the revival of some kind of political Islam across the region? Now, the results of this seventh wave of the Arab Barometer suggest that political Islam is making a comeback. That in most countries surveyed, citizens, both young and old, demonstrate a clear preference for religion having a greater role in politics. This is the first time that support for political Islam has increased in any meaningful way since the Arab Spring, just in the past 2 years. Now, although these trends might not continue, if they did, political Islam could regain its importance as a major political force in the region. Despite the electoral successes of Islamist movements in 2011, political Islam was not widely supported across the region at that time. In 2012 to 2014, no country surveyed did a majority of citizens favor religion having decision-making in government. In essence, the questions ask if religion should play a greater role in politics, and today the overwhelming answer is yes. Might this return to a moment of opposition provided for the greater appeal of political Islam? Data from this barometer strongly suggests that this is possible. Since 2018 to 2019, the support for the ideologies of political Islam have been on the rise. And in 2021 to 2022, roughly half or more than 5 to 10 countries surveyed have said that religion should have a role in democratic decisions in government. While youth, 18 to 19, led the return to religion across the MENA, the rise in support for religion and politics is more widespread across society. In most countries, both older and younger members of society are shifting their views. Youth are more positively dispositioned toward the role of religion and politics. For those who are 30 years and older, the results are relatively similar. Now, age matters, because in the first bracket, 18 to 29, they don't have a deep memory or any memory of Mubarak and the Muslim Brotherhood as a banned opposition party, or the Muslim Brotherhood social services that people argue which led to their popularity. These young people don't have a reference point of that. And so overall, these results suggest that support for political Islam is actually on the upswing. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that political Islam as an ideology will grow into a popular movement as it did in the 90s and 2000s. And as I chronicle in my monograph, yet this data does show that there is a rise in religiosity that's observed over the past 5 years, and that it's possible, perhaps, that the trend could be reversed, or that it may or may not lead into a political opposition. But we need to understand what all of this means. These indicators are more new, and they need to be understood. But what's really important, I think, is that in the past few years, there are two trends. First, the support for democracy as a system of governance, even without the United States as a model, and a shift that religion should play a role in politics. While causality is unclear, and this shift may not be due to the success or failure of Islamist parties of the past, but these are things that we need to keep in mind as we move forward, as we continue to talk about this region, because as we talk about it as people from the outside looking in, the people on the inside might be telling us a different story. Thank you.
Fahmi. Next, I'm going to ask Shadi Hamid, who's the columnist and member of the editorial board at the Washington Post, to close us out. This is, thanks. Yeah, so moving around.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Okay, so I guess let's get right to it. Our side of the debate, we lost. We lost the debate. And I think that's part of the reason that many of us are here. We're trying to take stock of our position in the minority. I think we fought valiantly I think that our side, we did a lot, we said a lot, we talked to most of the policymakers responsible for U.S. policy. Some of us are friends with them. We talk to them on a regular basis. They just decided to go in a very different direction than the one that we preferred. We gave it a good shot. So, like, now where does that leave us? And I'll just kind of offer some reflections and also drawing on some of the remarks of my panelists, and maybe even ending with something constructive. Okay, so I think one thing that I've changed on, and I think that is the role of Israel, and I think that Nader got to some of this in an important way, but I want to dig a little bit deeper here. When the Arab Spring happened, I think a lot of us, we were sort of reassured by the fact that Israel was not central. Yes, there were the occasional chants where people would say mean things about Israel and Tahrir Square, and I think a lot of us who were there at the time, we didn't want to emphasize that too much in the Western media because we wanted to present this image that, this isn't about Israel or anti-Americanism. This is about a genuine desire for freedom and democracy. The U.S. should support that, and we didn't want to get distracted with some of the complications. But I think it's still fair to say that for the most part, it wasn't about Israel, and I think there was something liberating about that prospect that we could focus on Arab dictatorships, and we wouldn't have to worry so much about what's sometimes called linkage theory, the idea that the only way to make progress in the Middle East is if you first make progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The idea with linkage theory is you have to address that first. And I think a lot of us wanted to push back against that idea because obviously peace was not forthcoming, so there was no real reason to kind of hold democracy and hold the freedom and rights of hundreds of millions of Arabs to whether or not there could be a viable two-state solution or peace process. So I think now, looking back, I think that we were wrong. Linkage theory does matter. Israel is a big part of the problem, and I'll talk about where exactly I think the problem is. But we can't ignore that any longer. And I think what the Gaza war offers up, it offers an entry point into this very difficult conversation that as much as we want to say that we can separate supporting democracy in the Middle East from support for a two-state solution, or for that matter, a one-state solution, we can't really separate them. That's a thing that we have to contend with. And as much as we might want to resist that intertwining, I think that the Gaza war has made this clear once and for all in a quite definitive way that the two go together for both better and worse. And I think in some ways this probably wasn't a secret to many of you. I think it's always been in the margins of the conversation. It's something that and just to give a couple examples, I mean, I think we probably have to go back to the 1990s where we see how linkage theory really worked out. And I'll just mention one example of this. Basically, the U.S. was supporting democratic transitions in other parts of the world, but not in the Middle East. There was triumphalism after the end of the Cold War, so we should have been able to do better in the Middle East, but we didn't. And, one thing that some of you may have heard me talk about this in the book talk that I did with CSID for my recent book, The Problem of Democracy. And I'll just mention, one quote from the book. Basically what I did in the book is I tried to interview a lot of senior Bush and Obama administration officials, including on the question of Israel. And this was obviously well before October 7th. So I think it's now even a bigger issue. But I'll mention one quote from Martin Indyk, former U.S. ambassador to Israel, former Assistant Secretary of State. And he was very forthright with me in the interviews that I did with him. And this one, I think, really stands out about the 1990s and how U.S. policymakers made a very conscious decision to deprioritize democracy because they wanted to prioritize the two-state solution. This is what he said to me, quote, I'm assuming he started off Shadi, and then he kind of ... He said, we have a priority here called making peace, and we need the regimes in the region to support our efforts. And we're not going to complicate it by pushing a democracy agenda. I could second guess myself now, but I'm just telling you that was our view at the time. It was very much a Middle East exceptionalism, decidedly so. But it wasn't that we were all in favor of autocrats and were against democracy. It was just that peace is a heavy lift, and it needs to be the priority. And I'm not saying this as a negative thing to Martin Indyk. He's actually one of the people who hired me at Brookings when I was just a young person, and he took a chance on me, and I have a lot of respect for him, and I respect that he is very forthright about this when he looks back at his own career. But I think that quote sort of captures something that's been very explicitly at the heart of U.S. policy, which is the priority is Israel's security, the priority is pushing for a two-state solution, and we have a better chance of doing that if we have Arab autocrats. Nader touched on this from the standpoint of the Abraham Accords. So I think what you're seeing with just both of our remarks here is that there is, I think, a growing willingness and comfort with bringing up what in some ways is the elephant in the room. I do think this is the elephant in the room, and it's better for us to be forthright about it. I won't go into more examples. There's a lot more interviews like in my book for people who are interested, and I'm also happy to send a PDF if you want to do a deep dive. Feel free to reach out to me afterwards. So where does this leave us if we take linkage theory seriously? Well, I think that there has to be some kind of reckoning with the role that Israel plays in the broader U.S.-led regional order. Israel is at the center of it. And the only way that we're going to be able to fashion a different kind of U.S. policy that is more open to democracy promotion is by thinking about where Israel is going to be in all of this. And I think that one advantage that we have now is that younger Americans are increasingly skeptical of Israel's dominant role in the region. They're willing to rethink that. They're not willing to just accept a status quo where Israel is always the top priority. And so I think there will be opportunities in the next 10 to 20 years, we may have to wait that long, for a real kind of reprioritization of where Israel's security is and the hierarchy of priorities. But I do think that there's something reassuring for all the destruction of the past 6 months. I think that we have reached a kind of inflection point where I've never seen more mainstream criticism of Israel in very strong and sometimes even more than strong ways than I have in recent months. And I do think there is something shifting. So I think that does present an opportunity and one that we should be attuned to. But I don't think the answer here is to say, well, Israel is just going to be pushed off to the side, and that democracy necessarily means that Israel's place is going to be damaged. I think that one way of addressing this is to say we seriously promote democracy in the Middle East, and not just in rhetoric, but we have a full-throated pro-democracy policy, and we fundamentally rethink the structural aspects of it, because it's not about just tinkering around the margins and trying to improve U.S. policy. We have to go back to the very foundations of U.S. policy, and that is a heavy lift. But I think one way of perhaps reassuring people who do care about Israel's security is to say, well, the U.S. can do two things at once. It can put pressure on Arab autocratic regimes and use its leverage to pressure them to open up their political systems and so forth. But it's also the case that the U.S. can can put pressure on a future democratically elected government in any one of these countries and say, if you want to continue having U.S. support, don't cancel the peace treaty with Israel. That was actually something that was explicit during the Arab Spring. And there is a reason that the Muslim Brotherhood-led government of Mohammed Morsi wasn't going to tamper with that. So I think there are ways to kind of get around this dilemma or get around this elephant in the room, which is by saying that if the U.S. in good faith promotes democracy in the Middle East, it's going to have goodwill. It is going to have more leverage with the elected governments that come out as a result of any kind of democratization process. So I think there are ways to address this. And now just a couple last things that I'll end with, maybe more broadly. So I do think that there is a danger when we focus so much on America's role in the region and how America is one of the major obstacles to democratization in the Middle East. Sometimes that can be seen as removing agency from ordinary Arabs. So actually, I would not give this talk if I was giving a talk to Arab activists. I wouldn't want to depress them in this way, but, between us, or at least if I'm being forthright, I do actually think that if I was an ordinary Arab who was really angry at my government, I think it was pretty futile to protest, because as long as the U.S. presents this kind of block, I do think it is going to be an uphill battle. Of course, anything is possible, but I think one of the lessons of the Arab Spring is that even if you have people power, even if you have millions of Arabs across the region protesting for greater rights and freedoms, if the regional and international context is not conducive, then that can tip the balance one way or the other. So I wouldn't necessarily want to broadcast these kinds of ideas too much, but we are speaking here in Washington, D.C., and I do think that a lot of this is going to depend on what we can do in this city and how and to what extent there can be a new generation of policymakers and foreign policy thinkers who understand what we're saying here, and to try to help encourage them to get into senior positions in government. I think that is going to matter a lot. And we do know that in previous key moments, let's say post 9/11, you had a relatively small number of U.S. policymakers who were able to have a profound impact on the course of U.S. policy, the so-called neocons. They were, in effect, able to capture U.S. policy and push it in a radically different direction. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. In a democracy, that's what you try to do. You try to get your own people in positions of influence. And I think that for there to be the kind of change that we want, we're going to have to see something similar, a kind of pro-democracy, neocon cabal sort of thing. I'm partly joking, but something like that. Because, and we can get into how the role, So look, I think that there is a sense of futility, and I often feel that myself. Why do I keep on talking about these issues? What's the point? Should we just kind of give up? But external shocks can change how this city looks at things. 9/11 was an example of an external shock. I think the Gaza war is another example of an external shock that can force people to reckon with their fundamental assumptions about America's role in the region and the role that we can play going forward. And maybe that's a bit of a silver lining that I can end on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chef. I wholeheartedly agree with your last recommendation regarding getting the right people in some of these positions. Okay, we're going to have an opportunity for 2 questions. So if you can step up to a microphone. Okay, go ahead, sir. And I'll only allow questions. Go ahead.
Thanks. David Mendikoff, UMass Amherst. I do want to just say very quickly that this panel's very useful in that I think there's a lot of intersections that lead for lead for potential optimistic ideas. And I'm looking forward to what you say later, Dahlia, because I won't say it because you asked first question, but I have some very good ways I think that a lot of what people said could be synthesized very, very well. So, but I won't do that. So I guess the question is, can some of the things that you're arguing, ways to change the U.S. narrative from national security, and I think it's important to really think about security, national security, to human security, or Arab pro-democratization to recognize the power of Islamist parties. Can those types of interventions happen in some interconnected way? In other words, are ways that we might think about addressing the problems of pro-democratic work in the U.S. and pro-democratic work in the Arab world, are there ways that those might intersect? And can that happen without Israeli politics changing fundamentally? Thanks.
Who wants to take that one? I think Dahlia is going to go for it.
That sounds like a question for you. Well, I already spoke for a bit. Anyone want to just, yeah.
So I think Tamara mentioned this, and can the national interest protect human interest? And is it in the U.S. strategic interest to understand what it means to protect human interest? What we've learned from the Arab Spring is that the human dignity of individuals, when it's repressed, is not in any strategic interest of the United States in terms of regional stability. Stability and democracy are very clearly today not two sides of the same coin. The more repression, the more long-term instability. We know what the prisons of the 50s and 60s gave us. We know what the withdrawal of U.S. and Afghanistan is going to give us potentially. We know what's, let's not talk about Mosul. We're ignoring what's happening in Mosul, what's happening in Afghanistan. That the U.S. footprint of not protecting the sanctity of individuals is also in our security. So when we think about the national interest, can that be redefined to actually take human security seriously? And I think if it does, then it can extend to all of the aspirations of individuals. We have been hedging our foreign policy in terms of long-term interest for short-term goals. And if we truly believe in democratic peace theory, then we need to actually question why that's the case.
And just a quick thing to add. Part of the problem, though, I think, is that senior U.S. officials, at least Democrats, I think they are aware of a lot of the long-term arguments. So that when you talk to them one-on-one, they'll acknowledge, yeah, sure, you're right. And in the long run, it would be better to have democracies, and that will be more conducive to stability. But the problem is they have short-term priorities, and that's how they orient themselves in terms of what they do every day. And quite honestly, they're a little bit lazy. They don't want to do like the heavy, it takes a lot of work to reorient U.S. policy in the Middle East. And they're asking themselves, why should I put in all of this work when I'll probably get shot down by like President Biden or Brett McGurk? And there's basically just there's really two or three people who run Middle East policy now and make all the final decisions, Brett McGurk, Jake Sullivan, and President Biden. So I think there is also an incentive structure problem here, that the intellectual arguments are compelling, but it seems so overwhelming and so difficult that people say, well, I'm just not going to really get into it. I'm going to accept the way things are. And I think that's going to be one of the key challenges, is how do you convince people to really put themselves on the line internally in the bureaucracy to push for different outcomes?
Can I just add something quickly to that? I'm not sure if this addresses your question, but the way I read your question reminds me of the theme of nationalism in the Middle East, independent nationalism, whether it's secular or religious. And that's the core problem for U.S. foreign policy. The reason why Mossadegh and Nasser were considered to be pariah figures, even though they weren't Islamists at all, is because they were challenging Western interests in the region. So they had to be opposed. And then in the transition to the late 20th century, when Islamist politics becomes mainstream, that's the big problem. I mean, and that's what it boils down to. And then on that issue, there's going to be fundamental issues of conflict and tension, one of them being the question of Israel. Independent nationalists within the region, whether they're secular or religious, want justice for the Palestinians. The United States is not willing to push or pressure Israel. Now, Shadi came up with an interesting formula here where, the United States could theoretically still support movements for democracy, but then lay a red line saying that if, you want Western support, American support, you're going to have to make some sort of accommodation with Israel. I guess the question would be on what terms? Which Israel are we talking about? But I think that's really what's at the core of this particular issue, as I understand it.
No, thank you for that. Okay, another question. I'll turn here, and then I'll come back to you, Professor. Okay.
Thank you. My question is about Kurds who have been systematically denied rights for nearly a century, and they are a distinct ethnic and politically organized population, large spread across countries, namely Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, as we all know, and so it's a story with all immediate parties being Muslim majority actors. And given their aspirations, given the Kurdish aspirations and mobilization, their story, how it unveils, will have serious implications for the region. So my question to the panel is, how these cycles of denial of rights should be responded to, and how do you project it into the future, the story of Kurds, and what it's going to mean for the rest of the region? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Anyone, the panel would like to address that?
Well, I'll offer a few comments very quickly. The tragedy of the Kurds is that they're broken up between at least 4 states in the Middle East. And so any prospect of independent Kurdish state, which I support, would have to deal with that fundamental problem. And there's no situation on the horizon where I can see any of those states willing to give up territory to create an independent Kurdish state. The best that one can hope for, and we've seen examples of this, not in terms of an ideal type, but some movement, is when countries that have a Kurdish population undergo some measure of partial democratization, which guarantees the Kurds greater autonomy, rights, and representation. So during the early phase of the Erdogan period, there was some movement in that direction. It shifted when it wasn't convenient anymore for Erdogan to move in that direction, but there seemed to be, that was a reflection of, a commitment to greater democracy and rights, and it had a ripple effect in terms of allowing the Kurds in Turkey to assert themselves. The same in post-Saddam Iraq, when that authoritarian model was taken down or it was removed, Kurds in the north expanded and benefited from that new political arrangement. That's the only model I see realistically, is that the greater there's democratization in countries that have a Kurdish population, the more there'll be a demand for autonomy, representation, allowing Kurds to have, teach Kurdish language and be able to be somewhat like, I guess, I come from Canada, like the Quebecois in Canada. Right? They're part of Canada, but they have substantial autonomy to sort of represent their values and their identity, but within the context of an existing democratic state.
No, I thought that was very good, actually.
I would just recommend Amy Austin Holmes' latest book on statelessness and how she saw an example of kind of a democratic space of Kurds and that powerful impact. It's a great book.
Okay, thank you. This was a great panel. My question is for Dr. Fahmy, but others are welcome to join in. So I think one reason for the public's indifference to military coups in Egypt and Tunisia, and even tacit support to coups, is related to lack of economic development following the revolution in both countries, stagnation and continuing unemployment. And this is not surprising in the sense that countries experiencing transitions usually do not have high levels of economic growth. But my question is there specific properties of Islamist parties that when they come to power, right, that cause underperformance in economy? This could relate to their organization structure, their relations with administration, or perhaps Mr. Hamid describes in his book deals with World Bank that were not implemented on time under Morsi government. So my question is, when Islamists come to power, are there specific endogenous dynamics associated with them that lead these countries to underperform economically? Thank you.
The first part of your question again was?
So just one question, which is, are the Islamists bad on economies when they come to power?
Thank you.
So if we look at the experiment in Egypt, it was 10 months long. And if we look at all of the indicators, both internally within the Brotherhood power structure and its internal failings, as well as external forces, for example, the fact that petro didn't exist, but then all of a sudden it came back to flow, or the power of the UAE in bolstering certain parts of the economy at the expense of others, or the power of the UAE in manipulating the media, right, and the perception of the economy, as well as what Shadi documents in his work. And so when we think about it, we can't draw these big measures about Islamists in power when our experiment is our end is 10 months long of one party. And so I don't think we can look at, say, yes, the internal dynamic structures and the authoritarianism within the Brotherhood led to failure on the economic level. I don't think we can say that. I think that there are fundamental internal failures, but I don't think we can extrapolate that onto the economy as blanketly as it might sound.
I mean, also people's perceptions of the economy are notoriously unreliable. So was the economy bad under Morsi? Yeah, kind of, but it was people's perceptions of the economy that were, I think, more relevant here, because according to most objective metrics, the economy then was better than it is now. On any inflation being the most obvious metric, I mean, Egypt's now an economic basket case of an incredible level. So I think there's this issue of how people will perceive the economy as being worse if they're unhappy about other things, or if they think that the Muslim Brotherhood is a profound threat to the identity of the nation. That's going to bleed into how they perceive the economy. So I think we have to be very careful about just saying the economy is worse under transitions or under Islamist parties.
So three quick points. When you study the main texts of political Islamists throughout the 20th century, you'll see that any discussion of economic theory is not the longest chapter in the books, right? Because they're about identity movements, and they're about resisting imperialism and struggling for self-determination away from dictators. That's point number one. Second of all, pushback on your suggestion. The first decade of Erdogan's rule in Turkey, the economy was booming. Then it went down. In fact, that's actually an argument to say that, the more there's democracy and democratic sort of opportunities, then that's good for the economic growth of the country. When things moved in, post-Gezi Park in the opposite direction, the economy tanked. And lastly, I would offer the point that, look, the economic situation in many of these developing countries around the world, particularly in the Arab and Islamic world, are so immensely challenging, given the massive population explosion, the level of corruption, the absence of accountability, that any government that comes into power, of any political orientation, is not going to be able to solve these challenges overnight, because the problems are so immense and deep-rooted. Largely because of, I would argue, the persistence of authoritarianism, the absence of accountability. Of course, the Gulf states are different, right? But generally speaking, the non-Gulf states. So, I mean, that's just a fundamental, fact of the reality of developing societies everywhere, including in the Arab world. There's no quick and easy fixes to the economic conditions of their citizens.
I remember the first part of your question was about military coups. Military coups, yeah. Support for coups and military coups that remove democratically elected leaders do not lead to better democracies and better economies. And that's just what we've seen in, none of these countries are immune to the laws of political science. And so if we think about the kind of trends of coups that remove democratically elected leaders do not lead to greater opening or greater economies.
I think last question.
Thank you. So my question is to Professor Son and Shadi. So Professor Son talked about the work, of past 20, 30 years, showing how Islam and democracy were compatible. But this was mostly theoretical in nature, and whenever they, this literature looked to real, world examples of success, it eventually failed. In the Arab Winter, Noah Feldman talks about Tunisia as a success case story just before the coup, right? And he says it might work because it worked somewhere. It's not all failure. Well, it's no longer. Turkey was this early, basically star of this literature, miserably failed. And also it's an Islamist government. Two Islamist governments in power, popularly elected, Hamas and Turkey's Erdogan AKP, really miserable, right? So there is no single example. Why should we be hopeful today that this work was successful? And I looked at this room. I have been coming to these conferences a lot since 2014. It used to be a full house, and not only just people who are interested in democracy, but also from security intelligence circles. They were interested in Islam as a threat or maybe opportunity, whatever. Even they are not in here. And I go to other events. It's not just CSID. It's Middle East Institute. Others. Nobody is there. So people are not even interested overall. So do you see all this work as a success? And also the elephant in the room. Turkey doesn't have any this issue of Israel as an elephant, but still it's very autocratic. How do you explain this elephant in the room? Because and it's Islamists in power, and Turkey is the first country which recognizes Israel. It doesn't have the same kind of Arab immediate neighborhood issue. So thank you.
But wait, Saeed, which one was the elephant in the room of all those elephants that you just talked about?
My question to you wasn't enough business, Shadi, for all this work, the theoretical and the conference and everything. Now we see zero examples that work. So why should we be hopeful? And if this work is about success, all the work these people did past the 30 years.
I'm not even sure I can answer that question either, but I do want to comment on, you're quite right that attendance is low. And year after year after year, we've had these meetings and attendance is low. Maybe you're noticing it is a little bit lower now. I'm not sure that's even true. It's always been low. And we always wondered why. Why aren't these, Radwan always wanted, we need to get people from policy-making positions and get them to hear this, because that's the naivety I'm talking about. We used to think, well, if they just understood things better, then they would know that we should be, policy should be supporting these pro-democracy movements, whether they call themselves Islamist or not. But what my point is that policy people aren't trained to care about things like that. First of all, they do need to keep their jobs. If they go outside the party line, they won't be promoted. They probably will be dismissed. There's no question about that. Their positions depend upon following the party line. It's structural. It's institutional. The ones who get hired are the ones who have been churned out of these programs that teach them to use this jargon, to use this language that normal people don't even understand because it's euphemistic, such as national interest. Nobody knows what that means, except if you've been in XYZ professor's class and know that that's a euphemism for making sure that you do exactly what your boss in the State Department tells you, or you're going to be fired.
Okay, so...
You should have him on your podcast.
Yeah, right. Look, I think Tunisia did work until it didn't. So, that was a somewhat long experience, relative to the rest of the region. It turned out the way it did for a complex set of reasons. I think it is worth asking why so many Tunisians weren't willing to fight for their democracy. That's where maybe that's a bigger conversation. I assume it was discussed a little bit earlier today. So there is that. It's unfortunate. Egypt did work, I think, pretty well for 2.5 years. I saw 2012 going into 2013. That was the golden age. For any of us who were spending time in Egypt during that period, that was incredible. If you value freedom and democracy and saying whatever you think. It is true that a lot of Egyptians don't value those things. Are they a majority? I don't think so. But among elites, they are very powerful. That's most of my family. They don't believe that Arabs should have democracy. That is actually, I'm sure many of you have family members of that sort. There's something wrong with Arabs. They basically have something akin to the Bernard Lewis / Brett McGurk school of Middle East policy making, if I can call it that. So that is a problem. But I don't think that the coup in Egypt would have happened if it wasn't for decisions the Obama administration made in a specific period of, I don't know, 6 months or 3 weeks or even 3 days, there were key things that were done that encouraged Sisi to go ahead with the coup. We know about this, it's well documented. So, you know, it could have turned out differently. We shouldn't look at what happened and say, well, it was a failure and it was inevitably going to be a failure. It could have been otherwise. There are counterfactual histories in which Tunisia could have still been a democracy and where Egypt could have still been a democracy.
Turkey, like no other political group, but still not.
I mean, Turkey is relatively more democratic than most of the Arab world. It wasn't one person, one vote, one time. It was, I don't know, there were 6 elections that were relatively free and competitive. That's a lot better than the entirety of the Arab world, except for maybe Iraq and Lebanon as the 2 partial democracies in the Arab world that still survive to this day. There are 2 success stories, we should say, in the Arab world, Iraq and Lebanon. Relatively speaking, let's not forget that.
Yeah, that's pretty
Maybe one more response. Yeah.
pretty relative. Just one quick comment to add to that. I mean, to be very specific, what we were looking for in the case of Tunisia, the question year after year after year is why is there no international investment in the economy? The experiment failed because the economy failed. The economy failed in multiple cases, but just speaking of Tunisia now, because there was no international investment in the economy. And without that, especially post-colonial government, you didn't have anything to fall back on. You needed external investment. When you have powerful actors putting the brakes on that external investment, or in the cases that we've been alluding to, we won't name names, but we know who was involved, direct investment in the coups that overthrew the democratically elected governments, there was no hope, no possibility. Whether you're Islamist or not had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like you to join me in thanking our outstanding panelists for their remarks and their engagement. I believe there are some closing remarks, right, Ridwan? Okay, go ahead. Maybe you could tell us who that is.
So we have